A 2-year-old boy vanished from a locked third-floor apartment while his parents slept 3 feet away. 30 hours later, he was found alive in a closet that had already been searched 12 times. But here's what nobody can explain. How did he get there? And more disturbing, was he there the whole time? What I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about missing children cases, because the answer isn't what anyone expected, and honestly, it's what keeps me up at night. Before we begin this journey into one of the most unsettling disappearances you'll ever hear about, I need you to do something for me. If you're someone who craves real stories, cases that challenge everything you think you know about safety, and the unthinkable things that can happen in ordinary places, hit that subscribe button right now. Here at the Cold Case Desk, we don't just tell stories, we investigate them. We ask the hard questions. We look at the evidence that others might overlook. And we're building a community of people who refuse to let these cases fade into obscurity. Your subscription keeps these stories alive and helps us continue bringing you the truth behind the cases that matter. So subscribe now, and let's dive into what happened to Dakota Hill. The story begins in Stafford Lakes, an apartment complex that sat quietly in Stafford, Virginia, like thousands of other residential communities scattered across America. There was nothing particularly remarkable about it at first glance. It was the kind of place where working families settled, where rent was manageable, and where the buildings stood close enough together that you could hear your neighbor's television through the walls if the volume was turned up too high. But what made Stafford Lakes different from some of the more anonymous apartment complexes in bigger cities was the sense of familiarity that existed between residents. This wasn't a place where people kept to themselves entirely. Neighbors recognized each other in the hallways. They knew which cars belonged to which families. They could identify the sound of children playing outside, and often knew which child belonged to which apartment, just by the sound of their voice. It was the kind of community where people felt comfortable leaving their windows cracked open on summer nights to let in the breeze, where the sound of footsteps in the hallway above you or beside you wasn't cause for alarm, but rather a reminder that you were surrounded by other families living their lives in parallel to your own. There was a rhythm to life at Stafford Lakes, a predictability that came from shared spaces and routine encounters. People left for work at similar times. Children played in the courtyard during the late afternoon. Evening settled in with the glow of television screens, visible through windows, and the smell of dinner being prepared in dozens of kitchens simultaneously. This sense of routine, of knowing what belonged and what didn't, made what happened on the morning of July 26th all the more shocking. Because when something goes wrong in a place where everyone knows the rhythm of daily life, the disruption is felt immediately and deeply. It's like a wrong note in a familiar song, impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. The Hill family lived on the 3rd floor of one of the buildings at Stafford Lakes. Leah and John were a young couple, still navigating the challenges that come with balancing demanding work schedules, long shifts, and the relentless energy required to raise a toddler. Their son, Dakota, was 2 years old, an age where curiosity outpaces caution, and where every waking moment seems to be spent in motion, exploring, touching, questioning, testing the boundaries of the world around him. Anyone who has spent time with a 2-year-old knows that silence is rare, and usually means the child is either sleeping or getting into something they shouldn't. The constant noise, the endless questions, the perpetual movement, all of it becomes the soundtrack of your life when you have a toddler in the house. On the night of July 25th, the Hill family's evening unfolded like many others had before. After long shifts at work, Leah and John came home exhausted, but still needing to be present for Dakota, who didn't care how tired his parents were. He wanted attention. He wanted to play. He wanted to watch his favorite movie, one of those children's films that adults find baffling, but that toddlers will watch on repeat for reasons that make sense only to them. So they settled into the living room, all three of them on the floor, with the movie playing on the television, and Dakota nestled between his parents. The hours passed slowly, the way they do when exhaustion has settled into your bones, but you're still trying to stay awake, trying to be present, trying to make it through just a few more minutes before surrendering to sleep. Somewhere around 4 o'clock in the morning, that surrender became inevitable. All three of them fell asleep right there in the living room, the television still on, casting its pale glow across the darkened room. It wasn't an unusual occurrence. Many parents of young children have found themselves waking up on couches or floors, having fallen asleep in the middle of a movie or a bedtime story, too tired to make it to an actual bed. The front door, as far as Leah and John knew, was locked. It was something they did automatically every night, part of the routine of securing the apartment before settling in for the evening. Lock the door, check the windows, turn off the lights in the rooms they weren't using. These were the small rituals of safety that every family performs without thinking. The unconscious actions that let you sleep peacefully because you believe your home is secure. When morning came, Leah woke first. The room was still dim, the television screen now dark, and for a moment everything seemed normal. But then that feeling arrived, the one that parents learn to recognize even before they're fully conscious. Something was wrong. The air felt different. The silence was too complete. Dakota was always the first one awake, always ready to start the day long before his parents were, always making noise, always moving. But now there was nothing, just stillness, just quiet. Leah sat up, and in that instant between sleep and wakefulness, her mind began to catalog what was wrong. Dakota wasn't between them. He wasn't on the couch. He wasn't visible in the immediate space around them. She called his name, softly at first, as if he might be sleeping somewhere nearby and she didn't want to startle him. But there was no response. The silence absorbed her voice and gave nothing back. John woke to the sound of his wife calling their son's name, and the tone in her voice cut through his exhaustion immediately. There's a particular quality to panic that's unmistakable, a frequency that penetrates even the deepest sleep and triggers an instant physical response. He was on his feet before he'd fully processed what was happening, both of them now moving through the apartment with increasing urgency. They checked behind the couch, thinking maybe Dakota had rolled off during the night and was sleeping on the floor. Nothing. They opened the closet doors, checked inside cabinets, looked under tables, moved furniture. 2-year-olds are small enough to fit into spaces that seem impossibly tight, and they have a tendency to wedge themselves into corners and gaps when they're playing or hiding. But Dakota wasn't in any of those places. They checked the bathroom, thinking maybe he'd woken up and gone in there on his own, even though he was still too young to manage most bathroom tasks independently. The bathroom was empty. The kitchen yielded nothing. The bedrooms, which they'd barely used the night before, were undisturbed. Dakota's room showed no signs that he'd been there. His bed was still made from the previous morning. His toys were where they'd been left. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the most important thing. Dakota himself was nowhere to be found. And then they saw it. The front door. The door they'd locked the night before, or at least believed they'd locked, was open. Not wide open, but ajar. Left open just enough to let in the morning air. Just enough to suggest that someone or something had passed through it recently. That single detail transformed the situation from confusing to terrifying in the space of a heartbeat. The sight of that open door changed everything. What had been a frantic search of the apartment, fueled by confusion and growing concern, became something else entirely. Because an open door meant Dakota wasn't in the apartment anymore. An open door meant he'd somehow gotten out. Somehow, made it past the barrier that was supposed to keep him safe inside. An open door meant he could be anywhere. Leah and John didn't stop to discuss what to do next. They didn't pause to form a plan. The response was pure instinct, the kind of automatic reaction that bypasses conscious thought entirely. They ran for the door and through it, their bare feet hitting the concrete walkway outside their apartment, their voices already hoarse from calling Dakota's name. They ran toward the stairs, taking them 2 and 3 at a time, racing down from the 3rd floor to the ground level, expecting with every step to see their son at the bottom, sitting on the grass or the sidewalk, examining a bug or a leaf the way toddlers do, completely oblivious to the panic he'd caused. But when they reached the ground level, the area was empty. The small patch of grass outside their building, the place where Dakota sometimes played under supervision, showed no sign of him. There was no flash of the familiar shirt he'd been wearing the night before. No sound of his voice, no movement at all except for the gentle rustle of leaves in the early morning breeze. They expanded the search immediately, running toward the parking lot, thinking maybe Dakota had been drawn toward the cars. He loved vehicles, the way many toddlers do, fascinated by their size and their wheels and the sounds they made. Maybe he'd wandered out to look at a car. Maybe he was crouched down beside one right now, running his small hands along the tire or peering underneath to see what was there. But the parking lot revealed nothing. No small figure moving between vehicles. No child's voice echoing off the pavement. The minutes were stretching now, each one feeling longer than it should, each passing second adding weight to the growing realization that something was very, very wrong. 2-year-olds don't simply vanish. They're loud. They're visible. They leave evidence of their presence, dropped toys, handprints on glass, footprints in dirt. They cry when they're scared or hurt. They call for their parents when they're alone. But there was none of that. Just absence. Just a void where a child should be. Leah and John split up, each taking a different direction, both of them calling Dakota's name over and over, their voices carrying across the quiet complex. The sun was rising now, casting long shadows across the buildings, and the morning was beginning to wake up around them. Other residents would be stirring soon, preparing for work, getting their own children ready for the day. But right now, in these early minutes of the search, it felt like Leah and John were alone in the world, trapped in a nightmare that made no logical sense. What they didn't know yet, what wouldn't be revealed until later, was that someone had heard something during the night. The neighbor who lived directly below the Hill family's apartment would later report that around 4:30 in the morning, she'd been awakened by sounds coming from above her. Small footsteps, the kind that could only belong to a child, moving across the floor of the apartment overhead. She'd heard them before, of course. Living in an apartment meant accepting a certain level of noise from your neighbors, and families with young children were naturally going to produce more sound than others. Small feet running across floors, the occasional thud of something being dropped, the muffled sounds of play and activity. These were all part of the ambient noise of apartment living. So when she heard those footsteps that morning, she didn't think anything of it. Children woke early sometimes. They got up before their parents and wandered around the apartment. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't concerning. She'd simply rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. But then she'd heard something else, the distinct sound of a door closing. Not a slam, but the quieter sound of a door being pushed shut carefully, the way you might close a door when you're trying not to wake someone. Even that hadn't alarmed her at the time. Maybe the parents were up. Maybe they were checking on their child. Maybe someone had gone to the bathroom and closed the door behind them. There were a dozen innocent explanations for the sounds she was hearing. And at 4:30 in the morning, when you're trying to sleep, you don't dwell on the mundane noises from the apartment above you. She went back to sleep, unaware that those sounds she'd heard, those unremarkable footsteps, and that quiet door closing would soon become crucial pieces of information in understanding what had happened to Dakota Hill. But that knowledge would come later. In the immediate aftermath of Dakota's disappearance, this witness didn't yet know that her information was important. She wouldn't know until the search had already begun, until the panic had already spread through the complex. As Leah and John continued their frantic search, their voices grew more desperate. They were calling Dakota's name constantly now, the same word repeated over and over like a prayer or an incantation, as if saying it enough times might somehow summon him back. They checked every visible space around the building. They looked behind dumpsters, thinking maybe a 2-year-old would be drawn to such an interesting object, full of strange smells and the possibility of discovery. They checked the narrow gaps between buildings, the kind of spaces where children sometimes squeeze themselves during games of hide and seek. They looked in bushes and under parked cars and in every shadow that might conceal a small body. Nothing. Everywhere they looked, they found nothing. The search was beginning to attract attention now. Other residents, hearing the commotion, were emerging from their apartments. Some were still in their pajamas or sleep clothes, having been awakened by the sound of adults shouting a child's name with increasing panic. Others were already dressed for the day, perhaps preparing to leave for early morning shifts, and they paused in their routines to ask what was happening, to offer help, to join in the search that was quickly spreading through the complex. Word traveled fast in a place like Stafford Lakes. When someone knocked on a door asking if anyone had seen a missing 2-year-old, the person who answered would immediately join the search and then knock on the next door, spreading the word further. Within a short span of time, dozens of residents were involved, all of them moving through the complex, checking spaces, calling Dakota's name, looking in places that seemed increasingly unlikely, but still possible. They searched the stairwells, thinking maybe Dakota had gotten disoriented and gone up instead of down. Maybe he was on a different floor, confused and scared. They checked the laundry room, a shared space that was usually locked but sometimes left accessible. They looked in the mail area, another communal space where residents gathered. They checked storage units and utility closets. They looked anywhere a small child could potentially be, whether it made sense or not. The community's response was swift and comprehensive, driven by the universal fear that every parent understands. When a child goes missing, it's not just that family's tragedy. It becomes everyone's nightmare. Every parent in that complex looked at Dakota's disappearance and couldn't help but imagine it happening to their own child. Every person without children still understood the fundamental wrongness of a toddler vanishing without a trace. So they searched with the same urgency they would want others to show if it were their child who was missing. But as the search continued and expanded, covering more ground and involving more people, a disturbing pattern was emerging. No one had seen anything. Despite the density of the apartment complex, despite the number of people who lived there, and the various schedules they kept, not a single person had witnessed a 2-year-old child wandering through the walkways or across the grounds. No one had heard crying or calling out. No one had seen a small figure moving through the early morning darkness. This absence of sightings was deeply troubling. Stafford Lakes wasn't a sprawling complex where buildings were separated by large distances. It was compact, with apartments close together, with shared walls and hallways where sound traveled easily. There were always people awake at unusual hours. Shift workers leaving for early morning jobs, insomniacs who couldn't sleep, parents up with crying infants, the elderly who woke with the sun. In a community of this size and density, someone should have seen something. The fact that no one had seen or heard anything suggested possibilities that no one wanted to voice out loud yet, but that were beginning to form in everyone's minds. If Dakota had wandered out on his own, he would have been visible to someone. He would have made noise. 2-year-olds aren't stealthy. They don't move silently through the world. They stumble and call out and make their presence known. The complete absence of any sighting, any sound, any evidence of Dakota's path created a vacuum that darker theories began to fill. People started asking different kinds of questions now. Had anyone noticed unfamiliar vehicles in the parking lot the night before? Had anyone seen someone who didn't belong? Someone standing outside too long, watching the buildings, paying attention to the families with young children? Had there been any suspicious activity in the days or weeks leading up to this morning? The questions reflected a shift in thinking, a movement away from the possibility of a simple case of a wandering toddler and toward something far more sinister. Parents began pulling their own children inside, away from the courtyard and the shared spaces, back into their apartments, where they could be locked safely behind doors. If one child could disappear so completely, so quickly, without anyone seeing or hearing anything, what did that mean for the safety of all the other children in the complex? The fear was becoming contagious, spreading from apartment to apartment, transforming Stafford Lakes from a quiet community where people felt secure into a place where everyone suddenly felt vulnerable. For Leah and John, the panic had evolved into something that was both physically and mentally exhausting. They were still moving, still searching, but their bodies were beginning to show the strain. Their voices were raw from calling Dakota's name. Their legs were shaking from running up and down stairs, from covering the same ground repeatedly. But they couldn't stop. Stopping meant accepting that they didn't know where their son was, and that was impossible to accept. So they kept moving, kept searching, kept checking places they'd already checked, as if repetition might somehow change the outcome. They expanded their search beyond the immediate area of their building, moving through the entire complex now, checking spaces that seemed increasingly unlikely, but that still held some tiny possibility. They looked in the community pool area, even though it was locked at night and there was no sign of forced entry. They checked the maintenance shed, the dumpster enclosures, the areas behind the buildings where residents rarely went. Every space, no matter how improbable, had to be checked, because the alternative, accepting that Dakota was truly gone, was unthinkable. Other residents were doing the same thing, creating search patterns that crisscrossed the complex, ensuring that every visible space was examined multiple times. Someone checked between parked cars, getting down on hands and knees to look underneath vehicles. Someone else climbed on top of a dumpster enclosure to look over the fence, thinking maybe a child could have somehow gotten into the enclosed area. People were looking up at roof lines and down into drainage grates, considering possibilities that seemed absurd, but that couldn't be ruled out entirely. The search was beginning to take on a desperate quality now, fueled by the growing realization that the easy explanations were exhausted. Dakota wasn't hiding in an obvious place. He wasn't asleep somewhere under a car or behind a bush. He wasn't in any of the communal spaces or stairwells. The apartment complex wasn't that large, and with dozens of people now searching every inch of it, the fact that Dakota remained unfound suggested that he wasn't there at all. This realization brought with it a new level of fear. If Dakota wasn't in the complex, where was he? How far could a 2-year-old have traveled in what must have been a relatively short period of time? The timeline was uncertain, but it seemed likely that Dakota had left the apartment sometime around 4:30 in the morning, based on the sounds the neighbor had heard. It was now past 6 o'clock, meaning Dakota had been missing for potentially over 90 minutes, maybe more. In 90 minutes, how far could a toddler walk? How far could someone carry a toddler? The questions were becoming more frightening with each passing minute. The possibility that Dakota had simply wandered off was giving way to darker scenarios. Child abduction, foul play, The kinds of things that parents fear in the abstract but never truly believe will happen to them. But now, those abstract fears were becoming concrete possibilities, and the terror that came with that realization was paralyzing. Leah and John were experiencing a form of panic that defied description. Every parent's worst nightmare is the loss of a child, and they were living that nightmare in real time, feeling it intensify with every minute that passed without finding Dakota. They were moving on autopilot now, their conscious minds overwhelmed by fear and unable to think clearly, their bodies taking over and forcing them to keep searching, keep moving, keep doing something even if it felt futile. They checked the laundry room again, even though they'd already looked there. They went back to the parking lot and checked between cars they'd already examined. They returned to the grassy area outside their building and looked in the same bushes they'd searched minutes earlier. It was irrational, but rationality had no place here. All that mattered was the tiny possibility that maybe, somehow, they'd missed something the first time. Maybe Dakota was there and they just hadn't seen him. Maybe if they looked one more time, just one more time, they'd find him. But each repeated search yielded the same result. Nothing. Just empty spaces and the growing certainty that Dakota was not going to be found in any of the places they were looking. It was at this point, with the search having expanded to cover the entire visible complex, and with no sign of Dakota anywhere, that Leah and John made the decision to contact authorities. It was a decision that came with its own form of anguish, because it represented an acknowledgement that this was beyond their ability to handle alone. Calling, the police meant admitting that this was a genuine emergency, that their son was truly missing in a way that required professional intervention. When Leah made the call, her voice shook with an emotion that made it difficult to speak clearly. She tried to explain the situation, tried to convey the urgency while also providing the necessary details, but the words kept catching in her throat. Dakota was 2 years old. He was wearing specific clothes. He'd been in their apartment just hours ago. The door had been found open. They'd searched everywhere. No one had seen him. Please, they needed help. They needed someone to do something because they didn't know what else to do. The dispatcher on the other end of the line recognized immediately that this was not a routine call. There's a particular quality to a parent's voice when reporting a missing child, a raw desperation that can't be faked or mistaken for anything else. The dispatcher began gathering information, asking questions that felt impossibly intrusive given the circumstances, but that were necessary for mounting an effective response. What was Dakota wearing? Did he have any distinguishing features? Any medical conditions? When was he last seen? Had there been any family disputes or custody issues? Had anyone threatened the family? Were there any registered sex offenders living in the area? If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. The questions kept coming, each one a reminder of all the terrible possibilities that existed when a child went missing. Leah answered as best she could, her mind struggling to focus on details, when all she wanted to do was scream, to demand that someone do something immediately, to insist that every second wasted on questions was a second Dakota remained missing. But she understood, on some level, that these questions were necessary. The authorities needed information to know how to respond, what resources to deploy, what kind of search to initiate. John was outside, continuing to search, unable to stop moving, even though they'd covered the same ground countless times already. Other residents were still searching too, their numbers having grown as more people woke up and learned what was happening. The morning shift at Stafford Lakes was beginning now, with residents who were just waking up emerging to find their community transformed by crisis. Cars that would normally be pulling out of the parking lot to head to work were staying put, their drivers joining the search instead. People who would normally be getting their own children ready for daycare or school were instead helping to look for someone else's child, united by the understanding that this could happen to any of them. The police response was swift. Within minutes of Leah's call, the first patrol car arrived at Stafford Lakes, its lights flashing, but its sirens silent, not wanting to add to the chaos or frighten the child if he was nearby and hiding. 2 officers emerged and immediately began coordinating with the residents who were already searching, establishing a more organized approach to ensure that no area was overlooked. They started by confirming the areas that had already been checked, creating a mental map of the complex and the surrounding neighborhood. More units arrived quickly, including supervisors and detectives who understood that time was critical in missing child cases. The first hours are crucial. Statistically, if a child is going to be found safe, it usually happens within the first few hours of being reported missing. Beyond that window, the outcomes become increasingly grim. Everyone present understood this, even if no one said it out loud. The urgency in their movements, the intensity of their focus, reflected the knowledge that every minute mattered. The police began their own systematic search of the complex, using techniques and training that the residents lacked. They checked locked areas using master keys provided by property management. They looked in utility spaces and mechanical rooms. They searched vehicles in the parking lot, peering through windows and checking trunks. They established a perimeter around the complex and began expanding outward in concentric circles, checking neighboring properties and wooded areas. K-9 units were requested, dogs trained to track human scent. When they arrived, the handlers asked for an article of Dakota's clothing, something that carried his scent, that the dogs could use as a reference. Leah rushed back to the apartment and retrieved a shirt Dakota had worn the day before, handling it carefully to preserve as much scent as possible. The dogs took the scent and began working, their noses to the ground, moving through the complex and beyond, following invisible trails that only they could detect. But the results were confusing and ultimately unhelpful. The dogs showed interest in certain areas, particularly near the stairwell outside the Hill family's apartment and near the building's exit, suggesting that Dakota had indeed left the apartment and made it at least that far. But beyond those initial indicators, the trail seemed to vanish. The dogs circled and searched, but couldn't establish a clear direction of travel. It was as if Dakota's scent simply stopped at a certain point, with no obvious path leading away from the complex. This outcome suggested several possibilities, none of them comforting. Either Dakota had been picked up by someone or had gotten into a vehicle, which would explain why the dogs couldn't follow his trail. Or he had traveled through areas where his scent was contaminated or obscured by other smells, making it difficult for the dogs to track him. Or he had gone somewhere that the dogs simply couldn't access or hadn't been directed to check. Whatever the explanation, the lack of a clear scent trail meant that the search couldn't be focused in any particular direction. Dakota could be anywhere. Law enforcement began conducting door-to-door interviews with residents, asking everyone the same questions. Had they seen or heard anything unusual during the night or early morning? Had they noticed any unfamiliar people or vehicles? Did they have any information at all that might be relevant? Most residents had nothing to report, but the interview process served another purpose beyond gathering information. It allowed police to assess the residents themselves, to get a sense of who lived in the complex and whether anyone raised red flags or behaved suspiciously. The neighbor who had heard the footsteps and door closing around 4:30 was interviewed, and her information helped establish a rough timeline. Dakota had apparently left the apartment sometime around that time, which meant he'd been missing for at least 2 hours now, possibly longer. 2 hours was enough time for a toddler to wander a considerable distance if he'd gone on foot, or to be taken much farther if someone had picked him up. The search radius needed to expand significantly. Authorities began organizing a broader search effort, reaching out to neighboring police departments and volunteer organizations that specialized in searching for missing persons. They needed more people, more resources, More eyes looking for a small boy in a red shirt and denim shorts. The description of Dakota was distributed to every officer in the region, along with a photo provided by his parents. The photo showed a smiling 2-year-old with bright eyes and dark hair, the kind of image that makes missing child cases feel even more heartbreaking because it captures the innocent joy of a life that's now in jeopardy. The media was contacted, and within hours, the local news stations were covering the story. Dakota Hill's face appeared on television screens across the region, accompanied by urgent appeals for information. The news coverage described the circumstances of his disappearance, the ongoing search efforts, and the desperate plea from his parents for anyone with information to come forward. The coverage was extensive because missing child cases always generate intense public interest and concern. People who had never heard of Stafford Lakes or the Hill family suddenly found themselves invested in the outcome, hoping for a positive resolution. Social media exploded with shares and comments, the story spreading across platforms as people in the community and beyond reposted information about Dakota's disappearance. Facebook groups dedicated to local news picked up the story. Twitter users shared Dakota's photo with pleas for retweets and visibility. Instagram posts appeared with hashtags urging people to keep an eye out for a missing toddler. The digital amplification of the search meant that within hours, thousands of people who had no direct connection to the case were aware of Dakota's disappearance and were watching for any sign of him. Back at Stafford Lakes, the scene had transformed into something resembling a command center. Police vehicles filled the parking lot. Command staff had set up a coordination point where information was being collected and search efforts were being directed. Volunteers continued to arrive, many of them strangers who had simply heard about the missing child and wanted to help. They were organized into search teams and given specific areas to cover, moving outward from the complex and organized patterns. The search expanded into the wooded areas surrounding Stafford Lakes, thick vegetation and trees that could easily conceal a small child. Searchers moved slowly through the woods, calling Dakota's name, looking under fallen logs and in dense brush, checking anywhere a 2-year-old might have crawled or hidden. It was difficult, exhausting work made worse by the summer heat that was beginning to build as morning progressed into late morning. But no one complained or slowed down. The urgency of finding Dakota overrode any physical discomfort. Helicopters arrived, their presence adding to the surreal atmosphere of the scene. They circled overhead, using both visual observation and thermal imaging cameras to scan the area from above. The thermal cameras could detect body heat, which meant they could potentially spot a child even if he was hidden under vegetation or in a space that wasn't visible from ground level. The helicopters covered ground far faster than searchers on foot could, examining large swaths of territory in a fraction of the time. But despite all these efforts, despite the dozens of searchers on foot, the K-9 units, the helicopters, the organized search patterns, and the widespread media coverage, Dakota remained missing. Hours were passing now, the morning giving way to afternoon, and there was still no sign of the 2-year-old boy who had vanished from his apartment in the pre-dawn darkness. Leah and John were being kept near the command center, not because they were suspects, but because authorities wanted them available for questions and updates. It was also a way of keeping them from continuing to search on their own, which, while understandable, wasn't helpful to the organized search effort. Parents in these situations often refuse to stop searching, running on adrenaline and desperation. But their efforts can sometimes interfere with the systematic approach that law enforcement needs to employ. They sat together, holding hands, answering questions when asked, but otherwise existing in a state of numb shock. The reality of the situation was still difficult to fully process. Just hours ago, they'd been sleeping peacefully in their apartment with their son between them. Now Dakota was gone, and an army of people was searching for him, and cameras were broadcasting his face to thousands of viewers, and none of it felt real. It felt like a nightmare they should be able to wake up from. But the nightmare kept going, kept getting worse with every passing hour. Detectives were conducting a more thorough investigation now, looking beyond the immediate question of where Dakota might be, and beginning to examine the circumstances of his disappearance more critically. They conducted a detailed examination of the Hill family's apartment, not because they suspected the parents of wrongdoing, but because the apartment was the last place Dakota had been seen. Every detail mattered. They documented the open door, photographing it from multiple angles, checking it for fingerprints or any other evidence. They examined the windows to confirm they were all closed and locked, ruling out the possibility that Dakota had somehow exited through a window. They looked for any sign of forced entry, any indication that someone had broken into the apartment to take Dakota. But there was nothing. The door showed no signs of being forced or jimmied. The windows were intact. There was no evidence of a struggle or an intrusion. Everything suggested that the door had simply been opened from the inside, and Dakota had either walked out on his own or had been carried out by someone who had legitimate access to the apartment. This finding led to uncomfortable questions that had to be asked. Could Dakota have opened the door himself? At 2 years old, it seemed unlikely, but not impossible. Some toddlers are surprisingly capable of manipulating doorknobs and locks, especially if they've watched adults do it repeatedly. The detectives tested the door, checking how much force was required to turn the knob and open it. They examined the lock to see if it required a key from the inside or if it was a simple turn lock that a child might be able to operate. The door was a standard apartment door, with a regular knob and a deadbolt above it. The knob lock was easy enough to manipulate, just a simple turn from the inside. But the deadbolt was another matter. It was positioned high enough that a 2-year-old couldn't reach it without climbing, and it required more force and dexterity to operate than a small child would typically possess. So if the deadbolt had been engaged the night before, Dakota almost certainly couldn't have opened it himself. This is where memory and certainty became problematic. Leah and John believed they had locked the door the night before, but could they say with absolute certainty that they'd engaged the deadbolt? They'd been exhausted. They'd fallen asleep unexpectedly in the living room rather than going through their normal bedtime routine. It was possible that they'd only engaged the knob lock and not the deadbolt. It was also possible that they hadn't locked the door at all, as horrifying as that thought was. The detectives had to ask these questions, had to probe these details, because understanding exactly what happened with the door was crucial to understanding how Dakota had disappeared. If he'd left on his own, that suggested one set of possibilities. If someone else had opened the door, whether a family member or an intruder, that suggested different possibilities. And if the door had been left unlocked accidentally, that created yet another scenario to consider. While the investigation continued at the apartment, the physical search was expanding even further. Authorities were now checking storm drains and culverts, anywhere a small child could have fallen or become trapped. They were searching bodies of water in the area, including ponds and creeks, using boats and divers to examine areas that couldn't be seen from the surface. These searches were grim but necessary, covering the worst-case scenarios that everyone hoped wouldn't be relevant, but that couldn't be ignored. Local businesses were contacted and asked to review their security camera footage from the early morning hours. Gas stations, convenience stores, any establishment with cameras that might have captured images of the surrounding streets and parking lots during the time frame when Dakota disappeared. It was a long shot, but sometimes long shots paid off. Sometimes a child wandering alone would be captured on camera, or a vehicle that seemed out of place would be recorded, providing a lead that could break a case open. The afternoon wore on, and the search showed no signs of slowing, despite the heat and the growing exhaustion of the searchers. Volunteers took breaks when needed, drinking water and resting in the shade before returning to the search. Police officers rotated through shifts, ensuring that fresh eyes were always involved in the effort. The helicopters continued their aerial survey, their presence a constant reminder of the scale and seriousness of the search. Inside the command center, investigators were building a timeline and a profile of the case. They documented everything they knew: Dakota's age and description, the time he was last seen, the approximate time he likely left the apartment based on the neighbor's statement, the physical characteristics of the apartment and the complex, the weather conditions, everything that might be relevant. They were also beginning to develop theories about what might have happened. The most innocent theory was that Dakota had simply wandered out on his own, perhaps waking up before his parents and being curious about what was outside, perhaps following a sound or seeing something through a window that caught his attention. In this scenario, he would have somehow managed to open the door, which was possible if it hadn't been fully locked, and walked out into the early morning darkness. From there, he could have gone in any direction, could have been drawn to any number of things that might interest a 2-year-old. He could have seen another child's toy left outside and gone to investigate. He could have heard a cat or a dog and followed the sound. He could have simply started walking with no particular destination in mind, the way young children sometimes do. If this theory was correct, Dakota could be anywhere, within a fairly wide radius of the apartment complex. He could have walked for blocks before getting tired or scared. He could have found his way into someone's yard or garage. He could have climbed into or under something and fallen asleep. The search area for this scenario was enormous and growing with every hour that passed, because a 2-year-old walking for several hours, even at a slow toddler pace, could cover a significant distance. But there were problems with this theory. The biggest problem was the complete absence of sightings. Even at 4:30 in the morning, there were people awake and moving around. Early morning commuters heading to work, delivery drivers, police patrols. Someone should have seen a toddler walking alone. And yet, despite all the media coverage and the appeals for information, no one had come forward to report seeing a small child matching Dakota's description wandering the streets that morning. The second major problem was the K-9 unit's inability to establish a clear trail. If Dakota had walked away from the complex on his own, the dogs should have been able to follow his scent at least for some distance. The fact that the trail seemed to end so abruptly suggested that Dakota's journey hadn't been on foot, or at least not entirely on foot. This led to darker theories. The possibility that someone had taken Dakota, either from inside the apartment or shortly after he exited. This theory raised horrifying questions. Who would take a 2-year-old child? And why? The motives behind child abductions are diverse and universally disturbing. Some abductions are committed by non-custodial parents in custody disputes, but there was no indication of any custody issue in Dakota's case. His parents were together, and there were no known disputes with extended family members. Some abductions are opportunistic, a disturbed individual seeing an unattended child and making a terrible decision in the moment. This seemed more plausible given the circumstances. If Dakota had wandered out of the apartment alone and encountered someone in the parking lot or on the street, that someone could have taken him. But this theory required a remarkable and tragic coincidence. Dakota would have had to leave the apartment at the exact time that a potential abductor was present and willing to take him. The most disturbing possibility was that someone had targeted Dakota specifically, had known where he lived, and had either waited for an opportunity or had created one. This theory suggested premeditation and planning, which made it even more sinister. It raised questions about who might have had access to the apartment or knowledge of the family's routines. Had someone been watching the family? Had there been any suspicious activity in the days or weeks leading up to the disappearance that the family hadn't recognized as threatening at the time? Detectives interviewed Leah and John extensively about their lives, their relationships, their work, their social circles. Had they noticed anyone paying unusual attention to Dakota? Had there been anyone who made them uncomfortable? Any repairmen or maintenance workers who had been in the apartment recently? Any neighbors who seemed overly interested in their son? The questions were invasive but necessary, each one designed to identify any possible connection to a potential suspect. Both parents were also evaluated as potential suspects, not because there was any evidence pointing to their involvement, but because statistically, when a child disappears from their own home, family members have to be considered. The detectives watched how Leah and John behaved, how they responded to questions, whether their emotional reactions seemed genuine or performed. They looked for inconsistencies in their statements, for any sign that they knew more than they were saying. But everything about Leah and John's behavior was consistent with innocent parents experiencing genuine trauma. Their grief was palpable, their desperation authentic. They cooperated fully with every request, answered every question, even when the questions were painful or implied suspicion. They consented to searches of their apartment, their vehicles, their phone records. They took polygraph tests and passed them. Every indicator suggested that they had nothing to do with their son's disappearance and were simply victims of whatever terrible thing had happened. As evening approached, the search had been ongoing for more than 12 hours. Dakota had now been missing for approximately 14 hours, and with each passing hour, the statistical likelihood of finding him alive and unharmed decreased. Everyone involved in the search knew this, though no one wanted to say it out loud. The volunteers were still searching, but their movements were slower now, their voices hoarse from calling Dakota's name thousands of times. The police were still coordinating efforts, but there was a growing sense that they might be searching for a recovery rather than a rescue. The media coverage had intensified throughout the day, with reporters stationed outside Stafford lakes, providing regular updates. The story had moved beyond local news and was now being picked up by regional and even national outlets. Missing child cases, especially those involving very young children, generate intense public interest and media attention. Dakota's face was now familiar to millions of people who had never heard of him before that morning. The coverage brought in tips, dozens of them, people calling to report sightings or provide information they thought might be relevant. Each tip had to be investigated, which created an enormous amount of work for the already stretched police force. Some tips were credible and required immediate follow-up. Others were well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful. Sightings of children who resembled Dakota, but weren't him, or information about suspicious vehicles that turned out to have innocent explanations. A few tips were from people who clearly had psychological issues or who wanted attention, making claims that were obviously false or physically impossible. These tips still had to be logged and evaluated, taking time and resources away from more promising leads. It was frustrating, but it was an inevitable part of high-profile missing child cases. The publicity that was necessary to generate legitimate leads also brought out people who wasted law enforcement's time. As darkness fell, the search had to be modified. It became more difficult and more dangerous to have volunteers searching wooded areas or unfamiliar terrain in the dark. Some searchers went home, exhausted and emotionally drained, promising to return the next morning. Others refused to leave, unable to accept that they should stop looking just because the sun had gone down. The police brought in portable lighting equipment, setting up bright lights in key areas to allow the search to continue through the night. Leah and John remained at the command center, neither of them willing to return to their apartment. How could they go back there, to the place where their son had been and now wasn't, to sleep in their beds while Dakota was somewhere unknown, possibly scared, possibly hurt, possibly worse? They stayed awake throughout the night, drinking coffee, answering questions when asked, existing in a state of suspended animation where time seemed both to drag and to race forward simultaneously. The night brought a different kind of searching. Fewer volunteers, but more specialized resources. Infrared technology that could detect heat signatures in the darkness. specialized search and rescue teams with equipment designed for nighttime operations. The work continued even as most of the community slept, the searchers driven by the knowledge that if Dakota was out there somewhere, scared and alone, every minute mattered. The second day of searching began with renewed effort, but diminished hope. The statistical reality was impossible to ignore now. Dakota had been missing for more than 24 hours. The chances of a positive outcome had decreased dramatically. But the search continued, because the alternative, giving up, was unacceptable. As long as Dakota hadn't been found, there was still a chance, however slim, that he was alive and could be rescued. More volunteers arrived, including specialized teams from neighboring areas. People took time off work to help search. Churches organized prayer vigils and volunteer shifts. The community response was overwhelming, a testament to the universal desire to protect children and the collective horror at the thought of a 2-year-old being lost or harmed. The search patterns expanded even further, now covering areas miles away from Stafford lakes. If Dakota had been taken by someone in a vehicle, he could be anywhere. The search was becoming less focused and more desperate, a recognition that they were now looking for a needle in a haystack, hoping for a miracle or a lucky break. And then, just when it seemed like the search might continue indefinitely with no resolution, something changed. It wasn't a dramatic discovery or a sudden breakthrough. It was something far more subtle and, in its own way, far more remarkable. A searcher, one of the volunteers who had been part of the effort since the beginning, was conducting yet another sweep of an area that had already been searched multiple times. This searcher was being thorough, checking places that seemed unlikely, but that hadn't been completely ruled out. The searcher approached a specific location within the apartment complex itself, a space that had been searched before, but perhaps not with enough attention to detail. It was an area that seemed too obvious, too close to home, to be relevant after so many hours had passed. But thoroughness demanded that it be checked again, and so the searcher checked it. What happened next would shock everyone involved in the search and would raise questions that would be debated and analyzed for years to come. Because what the searcher found was Dakota, alive, apparently unharmed, sleeping in a location that seemed impossible given how extensively the area had been searched. The discovery happened inside the apartment complex, in a utility closet that was located in a common area not far from the Hill family's building. The closet was used to store maintenance equipment and supplies, and it was kept locked under normal circumstances. But on this particular day, for reasons that would later be investigated, the closet had been left unlocked or had been opened during the course of the search. The searcher opened the closet door, expecting to find nothing but cleaning supplies and equipment, and instead found a small child curled up behind some stored items, sleeping peacefully. The searcher's initial reaction was disbelief. Could this really be Dakota? After more than a day of searching, after hundreds of people had combed through every inch of the complex, could he really have been this close the entire time? But it was Dakota. The clothing matched, the description matched, and within moments of being awakened, the child confirmed his identity by asking for his mother. The searcher immediately called out, alerting others nearby, and within seconds the news was spreading through the command center like electricity. Dakota had been found. He was alive. He appeared to be okay. The reunion between Dakota and his parents was emotional in a way that defied description. Leah and John ran to the location, their legs barely able to carry them after more than a day of stress and sleeplessness, their voices breaking as they called their son's name. When they saw him, when they were able to hold him and confirm that he was real and safe, the relief was so overwhelming that both parents collapsed, their bodies finally giving in to the exhaustion and trauma of the previous 30 hours. Dakota seemed remarkably unfazed by the entire experience. He was hungry and thirsty, and a bit confused about why everyone was so upset. But he didn't appear to be injured or traumatized. He couldn't explain what had happened or how he'd ended up in the utility closet. His vocabulary was limited, and his memory of events was fragmented in the way that toddler memories often are. He remembered walking. He remembered it being dark. He remembered finding a place that seemed cozy and going to sleep. The details beyond that were unclear or impossible for him to articulate. Medical personnel examined Dakota at the scene and then transported him to a hospital for a more thorough evaluation. The examination found no signs of injury, no indication that he'd been harmed in any way. He was dehydrated and hungry, which was expected, given that he'd been missing for more than a day without food or water. But otherwise, he seemed to be in remarkably good condition considering what he'd been through. The discovery of Dakota alive and apparently well was cause for celebration, but it also raised profound questions that demanded answers. How had Dakota ended up in that utility closet? The closet was not easily accessible to a 2-year-old. It required navigating through the apartment complex, finding the specific location, and getting inside. The door to the closet was heavy and required force to open. Could Dakota have done all of that on his own? And even more troubling, why hadn't the closet been searched more thoroughly earlier? According to the search records, that area had been checked multiple times during the previous day. Multiple searchers had reported examining the utility closets and common areas. So how had Dakota been missed? Had he hidden when he heard people searching? Had he been asleep and not responded to people calling his name? Or had something else happened? Something that explained why he hadn't been found until the second day of searching. The investigation into these questions began immediately. Detectives interviewed the searchers who had checked that area previously, trying to understand what had happened. The searchers insisted that they had looked in the utility closets, that they had opened doors and called Dakota's name. But the closets contained a lot of equipment and supplies, creating spaces behind and between items where a small child could conceivably hide or sleep without being immediately visible. It was possible, the investigators concluded, that Dakota had been in the closet all along, but had simply been overlooked in the initial searches. The closet was dimly lit, and the stored equipment created shadows and hiding spots. If Dakota had been asleep behind something, or if he'd instinctively hidden when he heard people approaching, he could have been missed even by searchers who were looking carefully. But this explanation, while possible, was difficult for many people to accept. The searchers had been thorough. They had been motivated by the knowledge that a child's life hung in the balance. The idea that they had somehow overlooked a 2-year-old child hiding in a relatively small closet seemed almost impossible. And yet, there was Dakota, found in that exact location after more than a day of searching. The evidence was undeniable, even if the explanation was troubling. Another theory that emerged was that Dakota hadn't been in the closet the entire time. Perhaps he had wandered away from the complex initially, either on his own or with someone else, and had then been returned to the closet later, after the searches of that area had been completed. This theory would explain why multiple searches had failed to find him. He simply wasn't there yet when those searches were conducted. But this theory raised its own questions. If someone had taken Dakota and then returned him, who was it? And why? What possible motivation could someone have for taking a 2-year-old child and then bringing him back a day later, leaving him in a utility closet where he would eventually be found? The theory didn't make sense from a criminal perspective. If someone had abducted Dakota, returning him alive increased the risk of being caught and served no apparent purpose. Detectives looked into the possibility that Dakota had been in the closet all along, but had been unconscious or in a state where he couldn't respond to searchers. Medical conditions, exposure, dehydration, all of these could potentially cause a child to be unresponsive. But the medical examination hadn't revealed any evidence of such a condition. Dakota had been dehydrated and hungry, but not to a degree that would have rendered him unconscious for an extended period. The investigation also examined the utility closet itself. Was there any evidence that someone else had been there with Dakota? Any fingerprints, footprints, or other physical evidence that might indicate another person's involvement? The closet was processed as if it were a crime scene, with technicians carefully documenting and collecting potential evidence. But the results were inconclusive. There were numerous fingerprints in the closet, which was expected given that it was a maintenance area accessed by multiple staff members. Sorting through all of those prints to determine if any belonged to someone who shouldn't have been there was a time-consuming process that ultimately didn't yield any clear suspects. The door to the closet showed no signs of forced entry, which meant it had either been left unlocked or had been opened with a key. Property management was questioned about who had keys to the utility closets and whether any keys had gone missing recently. The maintenance staff all had keys, and there was no record of any keys being lost or stolen. But it was impossible to know for certain whether someone might have made an unauthorized copy at some point. The most frustrating aspect of the investigation was Dakota's inability to provide useful information about what had happened. At 2 years old, he simply didn't have the verbal skills or the memory to explain his experience in a way that could guide the investigation. When asked how he got to the closet, he couldn't answer. When asked if someone had been with him, he gave inconsistent responses that seemed to reflect confusion or suggestibility rather than actual memory. Child psychologists were brought in to interview Dakota using age-appropriate techniques, but even they couldn't extract a clear narrative of events. What Dakota could communicate was that he had been scared when he first left the apartment. He remembered it being dark. He remembered walking and not knowing where his parents were. He remembered finding a place that felt safe, which appeared to be the utility closet, and going to sleep there. Beyond these basic facts, the details were lost to the limitations of a toddler's perspective and memory. The case attracted significant attention from child safety experts and psychologists who were fascinated by the dynamics at play. How had a 2-year-old managed to navigate an apartment complex in the dark? How had he survived more than a day without food or water while remaining relatively healthy? How had he ended up in a specific location that required opening a heavy door? The case seemed to challenge assumptions about what toddlers were capable of doing independently. Some experts suggested that Dakota's survival was due to a combination of factors, including luck, the relatively mild weather, and the fact that he had found a safe, enclosed space where he could sleep. 2-year-olds are remarkably resilient in some ways, and Dakota's ability to find shelter and remain calm enough to sleep rather than panic was probably crucial to his survival. If he had continued wandering, he could have encountered traffic or other dangers. If he had panicked and cried continuously, he might have exhausted himself or attracted the wrong kind of attention. Instead, his instinct to find a quiet place and wait, even if that instinct was unconscious, may have saved his life. The case also raised questions about the effectiveness of search efforts and the possibility that even thorough searches can miss what they're looking for. Search and rescue experts examined the case as a learning opportunity, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how future searches could be improved. The consensus was that while the searches had been conducted properly according to established protocols, the circumstances of this particular case had created a perfect storm of factors that allowed Dakota to be overlooked initially. The enclosed nature of the utility closet, the presence of equipment that created hiding spots, the possibility that Dakota had been asleep and non-responsive during initial searches. All of these factors combined to create a situation where even experienced searchers could miss a small child. The case became a reminder that search efforts, no matter how extensive, are not infallible, and that persistence and repeated searches of the same areas are sometimes necessary. For the residents of Stafford Lakes, Dakota's recovery brought relief, but also lingering unease. The mystery of exactly what had happened, how Dakota had ended up in that closet, and why he hadn't been found sooner, remained unsolved. Some residents believed that Dakota had been in the closet the entire time and had simply been missed during initial searches. Others were convinced that something more sinister had occurred, that someone had taken Dakota and later returned him, though they couldn't explain why. The unresolved questions led to speculation and rumors that circulated through the community. Some residents reported having seen unfamiliar people around the complex in the days before Dakota's disappearance, though these sightings couldn't be verified or connected to the case. Others claimed to have heard or seen things during the search that they hadn't reported at the time, but that now seemed significant in hindsight. The police investigated each of these reports, but none led to any concrete evidence or suspects. Property management made changes in response to the incident. All utility closets and maintenance areas were to be kept locked at all times, with access restricted to authorized personnel only. Security measures were enhanced throughout the complex, including improved lighting in common areas and the installation of additional security cameras. These changes came too late to help Dakota, but were implemented to prevent similar incidents in the future. For Leah and John, the experience was transformative in ways that would take years to fully process. The trauma of losing their son and the terror of not knowing whether he was alive or dead left scars that didn't heal quickly. Even after Dakota was safely home, both parents struggled with anxiety and hypervigilance. They installed additional locks on their apartment door, including locks positioned too high for Dakota to reach. They barely slept, waking frequently to check on their son and confirm that he was still there. Dakota, remarkably, seemed to recover quickly from the experience. Children his age have a limited understanding of danger and a remarkable ability to bounce back from traumatic events, especially when those events don't result in physical injury. Within days of being found, Dakota was back to his normal routines, playing with his toys and watching his favorite movies, as if nothing had happened. He occasionally mentioned being in the dark place, but he didn't seem distressed by the memory. For him, it was simply something that had happened, not a source of ongoing fear. The psychological experts who evaluated Dakota suggested that his young age had actually protected him from some of the trauma that an older child might have experienced. He hadn't fully understood the danger he was in. He hadn't been aware that hundreds of people were searching for him, or that his disappearance had generated massive media attention. From his perspective, he had gone for a walk, found a place to sleep, and then his parents had found him. The simplicity of his understanding allowed him to move past the event without the complex emotional processing that would have been necessary for an older child or adult. The media coverage of Dakota's recovery was as extensive as the coverage of his disappearance had been. News outlets that had been following the search closely reported on the happy ending, and Dakota's story became one of those rare missing child cases where the outcome was positive. The coverage shifted from focusing on the search efforts to examining the broader implications of the case, including questions about child safety, the effectiveness of search protocols, and the mysteries that remained unsolved. Some media outlets pursued investigative angles, trying to determine whether there was more to the story than had been publicly disclosed. Reporters interviewed residents of Stafford Lakes, searched for potential suspects or persons of interest, and examined whether law enforcement had overlooked any evidence. These investigations didn't uncover any smoking gun or hidden conspiracy, but they kept the case in the public consciousness and ensured that the unsolved questions continued to be discussed and debated. True crime communities online became fascinated with Dakota's case. Message boards and forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries and missing persons cases featured extensive discussions about what might have happened. Amateur investigators proposed theories ranging from the mundane to the elaborate, analyzing every known detail of the case and speculating about the unknown elements. Some theories were well-reasoned and based on evidence. Others were pure speculation, driven by a desire to find a more exciting or sinister explanation than the official narrative allowed. The most common theory among online investigators was that someone had taken Dakota from the apartment, or shortly after he left, kept him hidden for a day, and then returned him to the utility closet where he would be found. The motivation behind such an action was the subject of much debate. Some suggested it could have been someone with a psychological disorder who had taken the child impulsively and then panicked, returning him before the situation escalated further. Others proposed that it might have been someone who knew the family and had taken Dakota to teach the parents a lesson about being more careful, though this theory seemed far-fetched and lacked any supporting evidence. A smaller but vocal group of online theorists believed that Dakota's disappearance and recovery were exactly what they appeared to be: a 2-year-old wandering away from an unlocked apartment, finding his way to a utility closet, and spending a day there before being found. This theory required accepting that multiple searches had somehow overlooked him, which seemed unlikely, but not impossible. Proponents of this theory pointed out that the alternative theories all required believing in coincidences or actions that didn't make logical sense, whereas the simple explanation only required accepting human error in the search process. Law enforcement never officially closed the case, though the active investigation wound down after several months of following leads that went nowhere. The official position was that Dakota had wandered away from the apartment on his own, had somehow gained access to the utility closet, and had remained there until being found, more than a day later. This explanation was presented as the most likely scenario given the available evidence, though investigators acknowledged that some questions remained unanswered. The lack of a definitive explanation frustrated many people who had followed the case. In an era where technology and investigative techniques seemed capable of solving almost any mystery, the fact that something as significant as a child's disappearance could occur without a clear explanation seemed wrong. People wanted answers. They wanted to know exactly what had happened to Dakota during those 30-plus hours he was missing. They wanted to understand how he had ended up in that closet and why he hadn't been found sooner. But those answers never came, at least not in a way that satisfied everyone. Years have passed since Dakota's disappearance and recovery, and the case remains a topic of discussion among those interested in missing persons cases and unsolved mysteries. Dakota himself has grown older and has no memory of the incident beyond what he's been told by his parents and what he's seen in media coverage. For him, it's a story about something that happened when he was too young to remember, not a personal trauma that he carries with him. For his parents, the experience never fully fades. They've moved away from Stafford Lakes, unable to continue living in the place where their worst nightmare briefly came true. They're more cautious now, more aware of the dangers that exist even in seemingly safe environments. They've become advocates for child safety, sharing their story with other parents and emphasizing the importance of securing homes and remaining vigilant. The case has had lasting impacts beyond the Hill family. Search and rescue organizations have studied Dakota's case as an example of how searches can fail despite best efforts, using it as a training tool to emphasize the importance of thoroughness and persistence. Child safety advocates have referenced the case in campaigns about securing homes and monitoring young children. The apartment complex where it occurred has become known primarily for this incident, its name forever associated with the mysterious disappearance of a toddler. What makes Dakota's case so compelling and so unsettling is the combination of a positive outcome with unresolved questions. He was found alive and well, which is the best possible ending to a missing child case. But the mystery of exactly what happened, how he survived, and why he wasn't found sooner continues to haunt everyone who was involved in the search, or who has learned about the case since. It's a reminder that even in cases with happy endings, some questions may never be fully answered. The case also serves as a sobering reminder of how quickly a normal day can turn into a nightmare, and how the places we consider safe can become the settings for terrifying events. Stafford Lakes was an ordinary apartment complex where ordinary families lived ordinary lives. There was nothing about it that suggested it would become the site of a major missing child case. But that's precisely the point. These things can happen anywhere, to anyone, at any time. The story of Dakota Hill is ultimately a story about the fragility of safety, the limitations of even the most extensive search efforts, and the mysteries that can persist even after a case appears to be resolved. It's a story that asks more questions than it answers, and perhaps that's what makes it so memorable. We want to believe that every mystery can be solved, that every question has an answer, that every disappearance can be explained. But sometimes, as in Dakota's case, we have to accept that some elements of what happened may remain unknown forever. What we do know is this: a 2-year-old boy disappeared from his home in the early morning hours, sparking a massive search effort that involved hundreds of people and captured national attention. He was found more than a day later, alive and relatively unharmed, in a location that should have been searched earlier. His survival was remarkable. His recovery was a relief to everyone involved. But the exact details of his experience during those 30-plus hours remain largely a mystery, preserved only in the fragmented memories of a child too young to fully understand or articulate what happened to him. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, through every twist and turn of Dakota Hill's story, I want to thank you. This case represents everything we do here at the Cold Case Desk: thorough investigation, respectful treatment of the victims and their families, and a commitment to asking the hard questions, even when the answers are elusive. If this story affected you the way it affected me, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that stories like this matter and helps us reach more people who care about these cases. Second, drop a comment below. Share your thoughts on what you think happened to Dakota. Do you believe he was in that closet the entire time? Do you think someone took him and returned him? What's your theory? I read every comment, and I love hearing your perspectives. And third, if you haven't already, subscribe to the Cold Case Desk and hit that notification bell. We bring you deep dives into cases like this every single week. Stories that deserve to be told, mysteries that deserve attention, and families that deserve to have their experiences shared with respect and thoroughness. Your subscription supports this work and helps us continue investigating the cases that others might overlook. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about these stories. And thank you for being part of this community that refuses to let these cases fade away. I'll see you in the next one.